It's now my pleasure to introduce the first plenary session moderator, Ms. Diane Kaplan, the President and CEO of the Rasmussen Foundation here in Anchorage, for a conversation on healthy communities, resilient communities, insight from the Arctic. Please join me in welcoming Diane to the stage.
Morning, everyone. I'd like to invite our panelists to join me on the stage, please. Well, Rachel, I'm really getting with the new fashion accessory, the COVID bracelet that we've all got this morning. I'm going to hang on to mine. I'm sorry we can't see everybody back in this corner, but there's some other seats back here if your view is blocked, or maybe they can move the podium a bit. Anyway, I just wanted to add some color to Rachel's remarks about Little Diomede. I had a chance to visit in June this past year. And another couple of things interesting about that community. First of all, you used to be able to fly by fixed-wing aircraft over to Diomede several times a week. And now, because the ice is so unstable, the only way in and out of Diomede is by helicopter, which is very expensive, as you can imagine. And about 50% of those helicopters get delayed or canceled by weather. So getting in and out of the community has become extremely difficult and expensive. Here's another thing, and this will connect our modern world with a very ancient culture. The pilot on the way over told me that often, because of food shortages, they're bringing food from Nome into Diomede, but unfortunately, a good portion of the time, maybe more than half the time, the food gets taken off the plane and dropped in Wales because there are other things that go on the plane in itself. So there are food shortages in the community. And I said, well, what's going on the plane? And he said, well, think about it. If you lived in Diomede, what do you think is taking up half of the space in every single helicopter? Any idea? Anybody? Amazon boxes. No kidding. And you know, often you have a very small thing in a very big box. So when you think about square footage, the Amazon boxes are causing food shortages in a small community. Interesting. Well, our lands are places of great contradictions, I think you'd agree. Teeming with fish and animals and birds and edible plants, and yet some of our people are struggling for food. We produce massive amounts of fuel for the world, and yet some of our people are paying the highest fuel costs in the world. Our arts and culture are celebrated by people all around the world, and yet it's a daily struggle to maintain and propel them. And we know that of all of the 50 states, Alaska in the US is the safest, best state to be born in. And yet, by the time you turn 18, you're more likely to die in Alaska than in any of the 50 states. Sobering information. I'd like to ask the audience, if you had to choose one of these words to describe how you feel about the future, would it be fearful, worried, hopeful, or confident? Fearful, worried, hopeful, or confident? I want to give our panelists a little context. Who would say fearful? They're feeling fearful about the future. Anybody? Worried? hopeful, confident. Okay, that's very helpful, I think. With that knowledge, our truly esteemed panel is going to enlighten us from their very unique points of view about these and other issues in our world. And I'd like to introduce them to you. First, to my left, Valerie Davidson, who is the CEO, President and CEO of the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, our former Lieutenant Governor and Commissioner of Health. Valerie Davidson. Next, the Honorable P.J. Akiagok, Premier of Nunavut. The Honorable Caroline Cochrane, Premier of the Northwest Territories. And Tara Sweeney, former Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior and Principal and CEO of TAC 71. Tara. There were two panelists mentioned in your brochure who are not here. I just want to say a word. Minister Broberg, unanticipated change of government in Greenland 2 days ago and will not be joining us this week, unfortunately. And then also Gail Schubert, the President and CEO of Bering Straits Regional Corporation, the 35-year chairman of Bering Straits Regional Corporation, Henry Ivanoff, a huge leader in the Arctic in Alaska, a pioneer in broadcasting, former mayor for many years of the community, passed away, and he's going to be buried this week. I'd like to ask for a moment of silence in memory of Henry Ivanoff. Henry always laughed a lot and smiled a lot, so he'd want you all to be laughing and smiling in his memory. So let's start with our panelists. Given we are 2 years plus in on a worldwide pandemic, what strategies have you found, from your view, have been most helpful in alleviating what could have been or are disparities in tribal health outcomes versus the general population? And maybe, Valerie, that would be a good place to start with you.
Guyana Diane. So I would say probably the thing that has made the biggest difference in Alaska is really tribal self-governance and the relationships that we have with each other. In Alaska, there are 25 co-signers to the Alaska Tribal Health Compact, and we negotiate as a bloc. At a time when Alaska Native people were 4 times more likely to be impacted by COVID than any other person, doing things differently, taking the rules that were in place at the federal government level, if you're this age or if you have this condition, and also doing what we do best in self-governance, which is to create our own rules. Is there somebody in the community that we know who is especially vulnerable? Because, well, quite frankly, they've known us since before we were born. When we have language learners, some of the last language speakers and some of the last culture bearers moved to the front of the line to make sure that we didn't lose that capacity. The other is that I'm just continually struck by, in Alaska, we had a really wonderful working relationship with the state and also with the federal government, but tribal health really made the difference throughout Alaska. And it really struck me, it's kind of shocking that when those vaccines came, we didn't just take care of our own. We took care of everybody in the community. Because when my kids go to school, they sit next to your kids, and your kids, and your kids. And it doesn't matter whether they're native or not. We needed all of us, as many of us as possible, to make it through. And it really struck me that looking at our country's history and all of the attempts over time to really extinguish our population, it would have been really easy for Native people to say, well, you didn't take care of us, so we're not going to take care of you. And that's exactly the opposite of what happened. because it is our cultural value to share what we have. Even in times, and maybe especially in times of limited resources, we share more. And I would say that that was the biggest opportunity. When we do it well, when we remain who we really are as people, that's when we do it best.
I'd like to ask our next two panelists. I have a son and 3 grandkids in their Casca. They live in the Yukon. So I've been following COVID there. We haven't seen each other in a couple of years. The country's pretty much been closed, and the villages, but the vaccination rate very, very low, according to my granddaughters. I'm interested to know, in your areas of Canada, how you would respond.
Tu saksewa. Ko yan na megalo tavunga tunga subti takulu wata. Angit kakko yidjang tavunga tikikata. Ta na pimakal duanguman. I just wanted to start off by saying it's such a pleasure to be welcomed here into Alaska. I felt like I was coming home. I just want to go back to the story of that little boy, because that little boy resembles exactly to me. So I grew up in the most northern community in North America. It's a little community called Grise Fjord. It's on the southern tip of Ellesmere Island, and there's only 120 people. So it's a very small settlement, but really a very vibrant community. And with that in mind, we do see climate change impacting us directly. But really, I really see the strength and the resiliency of the members there, of the Inuit who have been stewards there, that I just wanted to point how strong we are. Just really hit me for how this symposium got started. But I share the same story in terms of how strong our communities have become. And the partnership, it really is about partnerships that really allowed us to be able to overcome the challenges. I think we're all aware of the infrastructure gaps that we see right across our vast communities. Many of them are fly-in communities. Just in the territory that I represent, with the 25 communities, every one of them is only a fly-in community. There is no highways that we see here. So the challenge was already there in terms of the deficits, whether it's through infrastructure, whether it was telehealth, whether it was the ability for hospitals to be accessible. So it really took a community approach and a partnership approach with the federal government, realizing we are at a disadvantage for us to be prioritized. That was very important, but allowing our communities really to work, whether it's from the municipal level to the territorial level, but more so into the Inuit governance level as well, where everybody really played a crucial role. Of allowing the vaccination of especially elders and children that are there, realizing the number one issue that we see in Nunavut is the lack of housing. I believe that's something I've heard already shared amongst just the first morning I've been here, the challenges and the crippling impact that has on our people. And as such, it's something I really think there's a lot of solutions that I'm hearing already. First thing this morning, that's where we have to put our focus and attention moving forward. So,
Thank you. Carol.
Okay, I have to agree with the Premier from Nunavut. I'll start with saying that our healthcare system in the Northwest Territories, which is part of Canada, is different. It's public. So there's no difference between Indigenous people or non-Indigenous people. Everyone gets the same service. And in the Northwest Territories, actually, it's better. We don't pay for our healthcare. The government pays for it big time. But people individually don't have to pay like other areas of Canada do. So that gives a little bit more equality within that. But in saying that, like Nunavut, the Northwest Territories doesn't have a lot of infrastructure in roads, infrastructure in a lot of things, but roads into communities. So some of our very smallest communities have no road system in, and they have very few jobs in those communities. There's not a lot of economic revenues there. So there's only a couple of jobs in the community. It tends to be a teacher, an RCMP worker that might fly in once in a while, perhaps a nurse, and maybe a health center if you're lucky. So there's already a disparity in that they don't have the capacity, the health systems that are needed when people are ill. I do have to give credit to our federal government. We've focused a lot on relationships because of so context of the Northwest Territories. Alaska is the same size approximately as the Northwest Territories in Canada, in our area. But Alaska has 16.5 the population of the Northwest Territories. We have just almost 45,000 people in the same size of Alaska with 33 communities. Anchorage alone has 7 times the population. So that tells you a little bit about, because there's money with people. It's called taxes, and there's revenues we get from our federal government for amount of people. So we're very poor, I would say. And Indigenous people even more so, because if you only have one school teacher who's teaching we have junior kindergarten, from junior kindergarten right up to grade 12, you can imagine the education system is lower. If you only have few jobs in the communities, it makes it harder. So when the pandemic hit, we spent a lot of time working with our federal government saying, you need to take care of Indigenous people. Indigenous people are more vulnerable. We're very isolated. We don't have the resources. We can't just get in a taxi and go to the hospital. We don't even have hospitals in the majority of our communities. So I have to give credit to where credit's due, and our federal government said, yes, we agree. So Nunavut and the Northwest Territories were the very first to get the vaccinations in Canada. So credit to the federal government. And then we started to track what was going on with COVID, because like all of us, we didn't know if we were going to live or die. When COVID hit, we didn't know if it was the end of the world or not. I've seen people saying they were worried about what's going on, and we've spent 2 years at the beginning in fear. I think if you would ask the question 2 years ago, how do you feel, there would have been a lot more hands saying fearful of the future. And COVID, we kind of got in control. Now we're watching Ukraine, so it's more worried. I can understand that. But we didn't know, and so we were very worried about what was going to happen. And we also have, because Indigenous people, I think in all countries, at least I'll speak for the Northwest Territories because that's where I'm from. Indigenous people have been used for many, many different scientific research. They were given medicines in days. Children were taken away and put into residential schools. People were taken to hospitals in the south, and these people never returned to the communities. So Indigenous people had a real fear about this vaccine that was coming, that they say was going to protect people, but we didn't know it. Should do some trials on it. So like I said first, it was really important that we built the relationship with the federal government to get the vaccines so that we could protect our people. And then it became really apparent that the government to the Northwest Territories had to build that relationship, work really closely with our Indigenous governments, because they were the people on the ground. They were the people that could influence their people. So we met weekly with all of our Indigenous governments every single week. And it was painful, believe me. It's hard being a government and having everybody scream and yell at you, but it was necessary. So by having those weekly meetings every single week meant that those Indigenous leaders could talk to their people and talk about the fears and talk about the necessity of vaccines. And that increased the amount of people getting vaccinated. But we tracked what was going on with COVID, as many nations did. And we found that Indigenous people more Indigenous people than non-Indigenous were in the hospitals. More Indigenous people than non-Indigenous were dying of COVID. And it wasn't because of our biology, being Indigenous. It was because of housing. It was because of overcrowding. When one family member got sick, the whole family got sick because we have 2 or 3 generations living in a 2-bedroom home. So it became our #1 priority of the government of the Northwest Territories. and hopefully became one of the number one priorities of the federal government. Our budget's coming out this afternoon, so we'll see if it's a priority for our government as well. But for the governments of the Northwest Territories, housing, as stated, is our number one priority, to not only deal with COVID, to deal with any pandemic that may hit us, to deal with economic opportunities, to deal with prosperity of people. We need to start with providing food, clothing, and shelter, and we need the housing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Tara, as the chief official in the United States, working not just with the Alaska tribes, but with all tribes across the country, what did you observe on how COVID was handled, and how do you think our only Arctic state performed?
Jimmy, can you hear me? Okay. Can you? Yeah, no. Now can you? Okay, there you go. I can hear me, yeah. Well, being inside the federal government when COVID first hit, one thing that I found I was extremely impressed with was the ability for the Alaska Native tribal community to come together and to advocate aggressively and clearly for the needs that they wanted to see, the resources, the Abbott testing machines, the need for vaccines to be deployed into our communities immediately and at the front of the line. And it was that calm, steady, persistent leadership that really propelled, I think, Alaska and the Alaska Native community to receive those services. Far often, we have a very different and sometimes difficult relationship with the federal government because our communities are so dependent upon the services that they provide. And what we benefit from in Alaska was that strong, steady, persistent leadership within our tribal communities, within the Alaska Native Corporation communities. And what we saw from the Department of the Interior perspective was communities or organizations in Alaska that normally would probably advocate in a silo or on their own were stitching themselves together as Native organizations to advocate for not only the Alaska Native population, but for Alaska in general.
Thanks so much. For any of the panelists who'd like to answer on this, are there any bright spots that you can see, things that we learned? We just learned, for example, maybe the need for housing has been highlighted or emphasized because of COVID. Are there other things you can think of that will be things we've learned or adapted that could be beneficial going forward? Something I'm thinking about now because the Rasmussen Foundation is wading into broadband and trying to get accessible, affordable broadband to every Alaskan. If that's in place, we now have a lot more tolerance and acceptance of remote work. So what does that mean if you live in a remote community with no roads, perhaps? Does that open job opportunities for you, assuming you have connectivity that were not available before COVID because there was a bias against remote work? My daughter-in-law works for a bank in Anchorage, and she doesn't deal with customers. She got a call. Do you want to work at home or in the office? She said home. She never has to go to the office again. She only lives 30 minutes from where we're sitting, but that would not have been a possibility before COVID. So anybody like to jump in? Tara?
Thank you, Diane. I feel really strongly about access to mental health. And one thing that we all know, we all have family members who struggle with access to mental health services. And COVID certainly highlighted the fact that we don't need seat time. We can work from anywhere if you are connected. But that also is an opportunity for access to mental health services. outside of our very small communities. If you're in a village where there's 120 people, are you really going to go and talk to the local counselor who may be related to the person that you're having an issue with? I mean, that's the reality of where we live and where we're from. And connectivity and broadband infrastructure open up the possibilities for greater mental health access to services for our people, and that is extremely important.
And Tara, I have to ask you something too, because I've been taking people up to your hometown, Ukiagvik, for many, many years. And I want to find out if I was lying, because I've always told them it was the farthest north community in North America. Was I lying?
In the United States.
In the United States, okay. Yes, I was.
You weren't lying, maybe misinformed. In the United States.
Anyone else like to?
Yeah, if I may as well, I think just to in that line, just the importance our harvesters have in our communities. The basic income that we've seen in terms of food hampers going into the community members who need it most, I think is another area that we really saw an impact, both on the mental state, on the social state, on the cultural aspect even, where it allowed the individuals then to go out in the land, which oftentimes is really, as a hunter myself, there's that special bond that holds as well. So I think that's another component on top of the broadband we don't have that many Southerners take for granted, whether it's for counseling services or educational opportunities or for remote work. So just seeing that, I think really has opened up the eyes of Southern Canadians, and I think there's been huge strides in the past where really the connectivity to the north has been a primary focus, but it's more investments like that open up as climate change comes and the importance of research starts coming as well. That really is going to be at the heart in the next decade coming.
So I'll just speak from the Alaska perspective that really Alaska Native people want what every other American wants. We want our children to be healthy, we want them to be happy, we want them to be well educated, and we want them to live in safe communities. But because of where we live, in such remote, ultra-remote rural communities, I feel like rural doesn't even begin to describe it, and because of our unique relationship with the federal government, we have to do things differently in order to achieve that same outcome. If we don't do things differently, we're not going to get there. And that's really, I think, what the pandemic has shown us. And so, for example, thanks to the board of directors for ANTHC, and I saw one of our board members here, Chief Gary Harrison, I want to acknowledge him here. Longtime priority for the board was to really address behavioral health issues. But how do you move forward in providing behavioral health services when there's still such stigma, as Tara said? And so we launched a behavioral health wellness clinic that is completely virtual, and it is really focused on making sure that that first call that somebody makes is really about getting them the services that they need. Some of that work is really removing the barriers, because right now in every other behavioral health program, when you present, you have to fill out literally 25 to 45 pages of paperwork before you even get to talk to a counselor. And so how are we doing that in ways that really meet the needs of the people? And here's one example. All it takes is a phone. You don't need any special equipment. Broadband, critical. But one of the counselors said, I want to start a group on healthy relationships. And looking back on that group, the person who was leading that group, who was the counselor for that group, a man. It was a group on healthy relationships. Every single person who signed up for that class is an Alaska Native man. That almost never happens. And they did that simply because sometimes when you create an opportunity and you do things differently to meet the needs of our communities, you get that kind of result.
I think I agree that for mental health, for services like that, it was critical that we increase the broadband. It was brought to a forefront. I also want to talk about the children in schools. When COVID first hit, we shut down our schools because there was outbreaks in our schools and children were getting sick. At that time, we didn't know that children were a little bit more resilient than our elders and our older population, but we were worried, so we shut down schools. And remember, I told you at the beginning, we have some communities where it's one teacher teaching whole grades, and so you can imagine already the disparity in education. And now we got no school happening, period. And in many of our communities, the broadband is so limited that you're lucky if you can get on for a few minutes of the day. In fact, when we were meeting with our Prime Minister, the Nunavut Premier was a great example because we were talking about broadband and his internet kept cutting out, and it was like, I couldn't have paid him to do better than that. Broadband is one thing, but I've always felt that growing up and being in the Northwest Territories is that the federal government always ignored us. We were kind of an afterthought. We're only 45,000 people. We're only one vote in the Parliament in Canada. So we were kind of like not given the opportunities that we needed to, in my opinion. So we always talk about an opportunity gap between the North and the South. Things that people in the South take for granted. Broadband is one of them. Road systems. People don't understand like how important it is to have a road. People say, well, and I think that's in all northern communities. You have small northern communities and there's no road, which means the only way out of that community is in an airplane, which is great to say if you come from a place of privilege and you have a nice job or you have an income and you have benefits from your people that are actually paying, and you can pay that $800,000 or whatever it may be to fly out to the nearest community to get food. But if you don't have a job in those communities and you're a traditional person and you live off the land, and so you're not selling your stuff because you're sharing. You know, if I go out and I hunt and I bring in whatever it may be, a moose, a caribou, then I'm going to trade versus actually sell, a cultural thing. So people aren't getting on the planes. So it's critical that our Prime Minister, similar to a president in the States, understood that it's not okay anymore. It's the time that the North has to have the same opportunities that people in the South take for granted every day. We need broadband. We need health centers. We need proper education. We need roads to communities. We need the same things that every single person in the South wakes up every morning and just takes for granted. That's all I want for, is to be equal.
Thank you. We have a lot of great questions from our audience, so I'm going to ask one at a time, and maybe if you want to self-select who'd like to respond to each one. The first one is, having multiple Indigenous representatives on the panel who cross international boundaries, how have you navigated issues during the pandemic through intertribal relations beyond countries? Great question. Anybody like to take that?
Okay, like I said earlier, relationship is key. Maybe it's because even before I got into politics, my degree is in social work, so I really realized how important it is to work with people and caring about people. So when we first started, I have to give credit to the Premier before me, we have what's called a intergovernmental council. At that table, we talk about land, resources, and royalties. So I know it's a bit different here in Alaska and most places. But the Indigenous governments and the territorial government work as one. I'm one member at that table. I'm not the chair. I share the chair. It goes around the table. And we actually, in this government, since I've been in power, we actually started a protocol for our legislation. So land and water resources is now a mutually defined legislation. It's not one government defining what it will be like. And that's when you really respect self-government and you really respect Indigenous people, then you work together to make the laws that affect people. Since COVID hit, we realized that land and water was one thing, but it wasn't enough. So now we have a Council of Leaders table that also works with all the other social issues, housing, education, healthcare, etc. Because they kept saying they wanted to talk about those things at the Intergovernmental Council. And previous governments kept saying, no, you can't talk about that. It's only about land and water and resources and royalties. It's not about housing. So I said, well, why can't it be about housing? So let's make another table. So now we have another table that we talk about that, and our first priority that we agreed to take on is housing. They are going to battle us, and it's going to be tough. I feel sorry for my housing minister because I kind of put her on the spot. But Indigenous governments and the territorial government are going to work together and look at every single policy that we have for housing to make sure that they fit Indigenous people. Indigenous people are 55% of our population in the Northwest Territories. And then we also have another table that's called the Modern Treaty and Self-Government Table, because I don't know if you have United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People here in Alaska. I hope you do. But the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People said that it's time to recognize Indigenous people. And so we take it very serious in the Northwest Territories. And part of that declaration says that you can't, just because we're doing this work, it doesn't mean that you just push aside self-government and say, like, it's no longer relevant. So we have a third table now that's called the Modern Treaty and Self-Government Table. Those are for tables that table is for people, Indigenous governments that have signed agreements taking care of their people. And that's all about implementation. So I can't really remember the question, but what I can say, what I can say is that working together is the answer. It's no longer appropriate to be colonistic. It's no longer appropriate to believe that non-Indigenous people have all the answers for Indigenous people. We all have something to offer, whether you're Indigenous in our nation, Inuit, First Nations, Métis like myself, or non-Indigenous. We all have something to offer. And by sitting together at tables and each person having an equal voice, then we shall be equal in the world. Thank you.
Well, you may not have remembered the question, but you did a great job answering. Perhaps as a consequence of the pandemic, but for other reasons as well, supply chain issues continue to be a major problem. I know at the Rasmussen Foundation, we fund a lot of capital projects, housing, et cetera. And clearly projects are running way over intended cost and also running way delayed and behind time-wise. Anybody like to comment on any approaches to dealing with issues around supply chain? Has it been an issue? And what can be done locally?
I'll go. One of the challenges that we have in Alaska is really the lack of infrastructure in many of our rural communities. We have 32 communities in rural Alaska who don't have running water, and they've never had it. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is how do we make sure that we can make sure that children who grow up in communities have access to basic running water. I mean, this day, 2022, in this great United States of America, people can't turn on their faucet and they can't flush their toilet. And so when First Lady Jill Biden came to Alaska on her way to the Tokyo Olympics, she was there to talk about vaccine awareness and distribution. And one of the second thing I said to her was, can you imagine being a parent and hearing all over the radio and all over the news and everywhere, the safest thing you can do for your family right now is to wash your hands constantly and maintain 6 feet of distance, and to live in a community where you know you can't provide that for your children and your family members, and you live in a house where there are 12 to 18 people in a one-bedroom house, and you're lucky because you actually have a bedroom. And for us, it's not theoretical, it's real. I remember flushing the khun for the first time when we first had running water. My parents couldn't get me out of the bathroom for an hour and a half because I thought it was the most fascinating thing in the world. And they listened. I mean, that's the wonderful thing, is that when you have the courage to speak up and say things and shine the harsh light of the reality of our situation with people who are in a position to do something about it, they do listen, and sometimes they're in a position to do that. And so $3.5 billion was included in the infrastructure bill for sanitation facilities throughout Indian country, and about $2 billion of that is, billion with a B, is available for Alaska. Since then, of course, the cost of supplies has gone up. the availability of things, even the electronics to be able to keep the systems from freezing, have all gone up. And so at the same time, normally if you were building a house or you were building something, you'd be like, okay, we're going to start ordering stuff really quickly. We're going to get this moving. We're going to move it to a place where we can beat that. We're going to beat everybody else in the country for these supplies, right? Because the key to keeping those costs low is getting in there first. But unfortunately, there are still so many rules, bureaucratic rules, that really prevent us from being able to do that. And so a big part of that challenge to make sure that we remove that potential from happening is to look at the way that we've always done things and ask ourselves, does that really make sense anymore? And I asked that of somebody recently, and they said, well, that wasn't our intent. And I said, I'm not talking about intent, I'm talking about outcome. And if you see the outcome that's happening consistently, it's irresponsible not to do something about that. So let's not talk about intentions anymore, and let's talk about outcome.
Thank you, Valerie. A number of you have mentioned mental health challenges. Are there any major government barriers that exist that could be addressed to better provide mental health services?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think the accreditation is something that often comes up. It's realizing the roles elders play as an example in the community. So as a new government coming in as well, obviously mental health has been at the forefront. We've seen right across our communities the highest suicide rates in all our communities. That has to stop. And with that in mind, it's the realization that the vital service elders provide in our communities. So acknowledging their training, oftentimes who is recognized as someone who has that degree, who's coming right from the south, who has no context and no awareness of our lives. And it's usually the other way, and I've seen myself where it's us educating the person coming into our communities. Oftentimes, so in relation to the question, I think it's recognizing really the vital resources we do have in our communities, whether it be the elders that provide those counseling services that might not have that degree from a prestigious university, but who does know the fabric, who does know the culture, who has that strong background, to really acknowledge the importance of that. And to the point of accessibility of resources, oftentimes federal governments do provide amazing national programs, but they're per capita basis, and that really prohibits the North our ability, realizing the remoteness that we've seen right across the Arctic nations, realizing the high costs that we just talked about of having no roads and solely relying on air or ship as cargo to come in. So realizing that, I think, has a huge factor as well. But yeah, to the recognition of elders, I think is so crucial that COVID has taught us as well how instrumental they've played now that we've really stabilized staying in the communities. I think for many of us, this is my first international trip since COVID, so I was a bit nervous coming even into here, but realizing that we must move forward. I think the results and the ability of the vaccine, the effectiveness of those have been laid out, so it's really starting to open up through that venue.
We have another question about approaches to the high rate of suicide. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I think I'm going to challenge a bit. My degree is in social work, and so I should be the first one up here saying that counseling is important, whether it's traditional, whether it's offered by non-Indigenous people, wherever it comes from. I do believe you need flexibility. I like the comment that you said that often the counselor in the community is your aunt or the aunt of the person that you're trying to get away from, or related, and so you need to have flexibility. And it was brought up in the need to have virtual mental health facilities as well. In the NWT, we spend a lot of time and resources on the land treatment and giving Indigenous people the tools and the resources, the money to be able to offer programs, because you can't always expect that people will do everything for free just because they're Indigenous. It's time to get paid. But mental health is bigger than that. It's not just about having a counselor or having access to somebody. It's having the opportunities. Can you imagine that child, and I don't live from that community, but that same child that was, I think, 8 years old, that said, I'm worried about the food. Imagine that child that had one teacher teaching 12 years of school, and maybe, if they're lucky, 30 houses in their community, and 25 of those houses are public housing operated by the government, low-income people, and no jobs in your community. So the only thing you can hope for is you're going to get income support in Canada. I think it's welfare in the United States. So you're going to have no house. Maybe you'll get a public housing unit. Maybe you'll live with generations of your family members. You know, who am I going to marry? You know, who am I going to meet? My education, I'm not going to get that university degree. I might not get a good job. You know, I might live off of the state. What hope do I have? And then that nice person shows up from the south and says, gee, I have the answer for you. It's called a little pill. Or it's called something that you can snort and put up your nose. And that'll make or alcohol, which was brought in many years for Indigenous people. That'll make you forget all your problems. So, like I said, mental health is not just about having therapeutic intervention, whether it's traditional or non-traditional. It's about taking care of the opportunity gaps that all Indigenous people have faced for decades. It's about bringing the standard of life, and all of us need to recognize that. Whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, you need to recognize that we're all human, and the best thing we can do to show that we're human is care about our neighbor, about each other. And if you really care about our neighbors and each other, then you will take up the battle to say that it's time to stop the gaps. It's time to make sure that Indigenous people have the same opportunities as everyone, or Northerners have the same opportunities as everyone in the South. Thank you.
Diane, just stitching together some of the comments. and
Maybe
the-
use the other mic if you would.
We can share, yeah. Just stitching together some of the comments and thoughts that have been shared around mental health and opportunity and suicide. When we struggle with access to mental health services, it affects not only the person, but the entire family and extended family. And so I agree with you that we need to have opportunities in our communities. And there are a number of, say, government officials from across the circumpolar Arctic here, and definitions matter. You want to talk about barriers to providing those types of services? It's in the definitions. It's in the definitions that are created by the granting agencies. It's in the regulations and the language, that the stipulations that are put upon the strings that are attached to the funding in order for an ANTHC to provide services to the communities. There are restrictions, and so paying attention to the language that is being promulgated by these agencies and advocating for an approach that is more culturally appropriate for our communities is really important. The second point that I would like to make is about opportunity. And when we are from remote communities and we are not connected by road, and the only way in and out is through an airplane, and there is the high cost of living, and all of these challenges and struggles, what are we doing as a business community and as partners with the federal government to drive investment and change investment behavior so that those that are looking to invest in the Arctic are incentivized to really invest in the smallest communities? If we're talking about climate change and mental health and we need investment dollars, how are we going to drive investment into a place like Anaktuvuk Pass in the middle of the Brooks Range that's tiny and very, very remote, where they have to fly their fuel in every year to survive? How are we going to change it for that community? And when we can answer that question, I think we will start to see tremendous success throughout the circumpolar Arctic.
So great comments. Perfect. And so I think what we're saying is that us talking about it alone isn't getting us there. We've been talking about these issues for as long as we've been alive, and it's not changing fast enough. And we need you, we need our allies making those requests and making those asks on our behalf. And I know some of you are thinking, well, I don't know, what can I do to help? And I'm going to give you one really tiny example. When you're looking at legislation and it provides the authority, I'll use the United States as an example, and you're providing new resources or new authorities to states, make a small little edit. Get out your pen, add a comma, and everywhere you see state or states, add tribes and tribal organizations, so that those funds go directly to us, or in Canada or in another country, however those funds get to a province, send those directly to the Indigenous people, because we shouldn't have to be beholden to another sovereign in between us and the federal government. You're just adding another layer of complexity. That's not helpful. The other is, I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and they said, oh yes, great behavioral health. We're gonna add more grants. It's gonna be wonderful. And I was politely smiled for about 9 seconds, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna tell you what I think, because I'm a truth teller, right? And I said, why don't you send those funds directly through tribes and tribal organizations, through existing structures, through compacts? Because when you do grants, they all come with their own rules. We have, instead of those resources going to the people who need the services, you know where most of the money goes to? Grant writers, finance department, legal department, and how much money is actually left at the end to be able to help the person who needs that care. And so stop doing competitive grants where you're basically pitting us against each other to do what we all need. And if you eliminated that and did it that way instead, again, anytime you see state or province, add a comma, tribes and tribal health organizations, or Indigenous people and communities, you'll make such a huge difference.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank the audience for all the questions. We have a lot of great questions we didn't get to. I'm really sorry our panelists were unwilling to give their point of view or be proactive, but we'll forgive them for that. You've all been terrific. I appreciate your frank responses, and please help me thank our panelists for joining us this week.